Hello folks, this is the first of two videos I will make where the idea is for me to just go over the possible games and settings that we could use for our play-by-post. And so I'm going to try to make these as brief as possible. I actually recorded a version of this that was over 40 minutes long, way too much, so I've pared it way down. I think the first thing we have to decide is if we want to use Savage Worlds, which this presentation will be about, or use one of the Lovecraftian horror games, which are Call of Cthulhu and Delta Green, which the other presentation will be about. And then once we've made that decision, then we'll have to decide within each one which setting we like. So this will be about the Savage Worlds game and the setting as it relates to how we would do it in play-by-post. So first I want to talk about the pros and cons of Savage Worlds Adventure Edition. The pros are it's a familiar system. I know it really well, and most of us know it additionally. It's a flexible system. We can do anything with it. And as a consequence, there are multiple settings available for Savage Worlds, which we'll talk about in the next few slides. It has a moderate level of crunch, which makes it maybe a little bit challenging for play-by-post, but also has enough crunch to keep people interested and enough mechanical grit to it that we can get involved in the mechanics of the characters and that sort of thing. The cons of Savage Worlds, first and foremost, are there are many call and response mechanics. This is things like you make a roll, and I then respond as a GM. You failed the roll. Would you like a Benny? Then you tell me, yes, I'd like to use a Benny. Okay, go ahead and re-roll it. You re-roll it. You fail it again. Would you like to use another Benny? Yes, I would. Then you roll it. Okay, I succeeded. And that number of exchanges might take multiple days in play-by-post. And there's almost no way to avoid that with Savage Worlds. Also, Savage Worlds has a number of session-based mechanics, and this can be very difficult in play-by-post because the whole thing with play-by-post is there aren't any sessions. It's continuous. It's happening asynchronously. And so bennies and adventure cards are things that last for the duration of a session and then refresh or are given back. And as a consequence, we're going to have to figure out how to handle what a session is for a play-by-post game. There are three settings that I would be perfectly happy to run in Savage Worlds. One is the East Texas University setting, which is a horror setting. It's an official Savage Worlds setting. The second one is Holler, which is a horror fantasy type setting. Also official Savage Worlds setting. I have the materials for both of these. And then there's what I'm calling Savage Harn. This would be a medieval fantasy type of a setting using the Savage Worlds mechanics and the World of Harn from the game Harnmaster as the world setting. But we wouldn't use the Harnmaster mechanics because those are incredibly complicated and would not be usable in play-by-post. So let's just talk about these settings. I'm going to describe each setting and the pros and cons of each setting. Remember that everything in Savage Worlds has all of the Savage Worlds pros and cons, and then we will just add the ones that are setting specific to these three settings. So let me describe the setting first. ETU is a setting in which player characters are students going to college, attending a fictional university in Texas. The setting is called heroic horror by the authors, meaning that scary and disturbing things happen, like your professor is actually a vampire and you have to stake him through the heart with some wood, but the PCs generally have a chance to save the day most of the time. Death is certainly on the table, but it's not as much as it would be in a game like Deadlands. Arcane backgrounds are not allowed in Savage Worlds ETU, but eventually the group may discover ritual spells, which can be made with a skill roll and a dramatic task instead of using PowerPoints, and the PCs may get access eventually to talismans, which are sort of like simplified magic items. So let's look at the pros and the cons of this setting. In terms of the pros, there are quite a few. There's a reduced emphasis on combat because you're college students and you're not combat junkies and fighters and paladins and stuff. The lack of arcane backgrounds also simplifies character design, so I think both of these features are lend themselves to play by post. The present day setting is familiar and easy to connect with, and several of us have extensive experience on college campuses. So, as a result of these two, I think the verisimilitude would be very easy to achieve. Another big pro of ETU is they have a player's guide that's just for players that has all the lore you need and nothing more, none of the GM info and stuff. And the PDF is only $5. So that should hopefully be within reach of just about everybody's pocket. And it will be easy to get the player-facing lore and read it whenever you want. The cons are there are additional session-based mechanics in ETU for some of the custom hindrances and edges. Things last for or take place a certain number of times a session or something like that. So in addition to the bennies and the adventure cards that come with Savage Worlds Adventure Edition, you also have these additional ETU mechanics. Also, the characters are relatively normal compared to all the other settings and games we're going to discuss, and so that may be unattractive to people if they want to play a more sort of superpowered type character. And so that's ETU. The next setting is Holler, an Appalachian apocalypse. In Holler, the player characters are everyday people working for the company which controls everything. The setting is described in the book as 1930s Gothic industrial horror. The player characters live in a land that is run by the big bosses. The land, which is in a spot of the Appalachian Mountains, has been tainted by something called the Blight, which makes it so the people can't leave or enter. Supernatural elements are present here, such as fairies and demons, because of the power of the Blight. People are trapped here and unable to get out of the region, except for the big bosses who are able to come and go as they please. The player characters are the ones who decide to stand up to the big bosses who run the companies that run the mill towns and the factory towns and the logging towns and the mining towns in this area. They decide to stand up against the bosses and to help the people of the holler. They come from all walks of life within the area, such as miners, lumberjacks, factory workers, and the like. There are arcane backgrounds allowed in Holler. There are three folk magicians who are like witches, moonshiners who are sort of like alchemists making brews for people to drink and use, and blessed who are like the ones in Deadlands. They're holy men and women. The landscape is dotted with towns run by the companies, right? These are the company towns that are built very quickly around a mine shaft or along a river where there's going to be a mill or something like that. And each town has a company store, which is the only place where you can buy and sell goods. And they only take either barter or a special kind of money put out by the company that's only good in company towns called scrip. As a result, people are mostly poor, and other than mundane items, it is very rare to find anything worthwhile in a store. And as a result, the authors warn everyone that this is Savage Worlds on hardcore mode. The lack of weapons or armor, because you can't buy them in a store, means that you don't have any extra protection. You're using improvised weapons most of the time, or just your fists, and your skin is your only armor, or maybe some tattered clothing. And so it's a dangerous place, and life is cheap in the holler. So character death is certainly on the table more in the holler than it would be in ETU. Here's a map of the holler just to get you oriented, since it's not a place that you would have heard of outside of this setting. And all around it, the black and with the and green, that's the blight, and it's poisonous and deadly, so nobody enters it, and nobody ever comes in and out except the big bosses and their direct lackeys. And all of the little red dots are points of interest, mining towns, uh, mill towns, factory towns, and so on that are scattered throughout the region. Pros and cons of Holler. The pros are it's a unique setting with lots of room to explore, as you could see from that map. It's very atmospheric, especially if you like gothic horror. It provides plenty of supernatural abilities for the player characters, so if being an average Joe in ETU doesn't appeal to you, being a magical character from here might. It's highly challenging due to the lack of available gear, which, if you like a challenging game, could be appealing. The cons are that it's an unfamiliar setting, it's unusual, and unless you've done some reading in the literature that this is based on, I had not before I read Holler, it may be hard to conceptualize. Um, I didn't get it when I first read the rulebook, and then I started reading the Silver John short stories and novels of Manly Wade Wellman, on which this setting is partly based, and now I get it. But those books are really hard to come by, so good luck finding them. I had to work long and hard and spend a lot of money to get them because you can only buy used copies. They're out of print, and they didn't make ebooks of them. Um, but because it's such an unusual setting and most people haven't read the literature that it refers to, it can be sort of hard to conceptualize. The hardcore mode that I referenced as a pro, if you like a challenge, isn't everybody's cup of tea, and some people would rather not have such a difficult, challenging game. That's certainly all right if that's your preference. Also, there's no player's guide for Holler. I don't know what we would do about this, but if you guys wanted to play it, I think I'd probably take my PDF. You're not supposed to hand these out, but I'd probably chop off the 200 pages that are only for the GM's eyes and just give you guys the 40 or 50 pages that are for players. But that does make it a little bit frustrating because there's no real player's guide. So that's Holler. And then finally, the third possible setting within Savage Worlds would be the setting of Harn. And for this, we would use regular Savage Worlds plus the Fantasy Companion, which has all of the special fantasy rules. In this setting, the player characters are traditional fantasy archetypes. In the sort of subcontinent of Harn, which I'll show you a map of in another slide or two, and this is on a world called Cathera, which is a fantasy world made up by the people who create the game Harn Master. The setting is medieval authentic. This means that it's sort of a pseudo-British culture with feudalism. Chivalric codes are in force in many places. So this means that, for instance, if there are certain weapons that are denoted as chivalric weapons, it's illegal to carry them unless you're noble. That's an example of that. It's what they call a magic rare setting. Magic is powerful, so it's not low magic, but it's not everywhere. It's only in certain places, and only certain people can do it. So magic is pretty rare. Fantasy elements exist, but because they're trying to go for a more realistic, feudal, medieval feel, the fantastical elements are de-emphasized. Because of this, death is a very real possibility in the world of Harn. Religion is extremely important. The churches are politically powerful as they were in the real world, although it's not a monotheistic society. There are 10 gods. Guilds have a very strong influence in the civilized nation. There are 36 named guilds, such as the Shipwrights Guild and the Wheelmakers Guild and the Leatherworkers Guild and the Tanners and so on. And each guild, you have to be a member of it in order to like sell your products within the city limits and that sort of thing. Most of the player characters would be expected to be human, although perhaps someone might be an elf or a dwarf if they really wanted to be. None of the other stranger or more unusual fantasy races exist in this world, just human, elf, dwarf, and maybe halfling. They're rumored to exist, but nobody's ever seen one. Most arcane backgrounds in the Fantasy Companion would be allowed. Things like bards and wizards and warlocks and that kind of stuff, clerics. This is a picture of the continent or subcontinent of Harn. It's basically a giant island. It's supposed to be kind of this world's analog of the British Isles, but instead of being a chain of islands like Britain is, it's just a bigger subcontinent, sort of the area of maybe France and Germany combined. So it's quite large. You can see there are some smaller kingdoms around, and what I would probably do if we wanted to play here was this in the lower southeast part. You see this little purple kingdom named Chibisa. It used to be much larger. It used to once stretch from Caldor to Meldarin, which are in the north and the southeast of it, but it has collapsed, and one of the dukes in right along the river, or not a duke. The king rules it. This is a baron, I guess. He's trying to extend his holdings, and I think it might be interesting to sort of play in this area where there are a bunch of barbarian tribes. They're named in the brown, Pagalin, Bujoch, etc. And there's a bunch of orcs that live around in the mountains and that sort of thing. So I think um, this could be a very interesting place to play in Harn. So the pros and cons of playing Savage Worlds using Harn. The pros are it's incredibly realistic. It's a very detailed setting that's been under development since 1983 by medieval historians and enthusiasts. It's what I call nested almost endlessly. So there, you can play within a kingdom in Harn. We can telescope out and there's Harn. You can zoom out and there's the continent of Lithia, which Harn is next to. You zoom out further and you've got the world of Cathera. You zoom out further and you've got what they call the Kethrian neighborhood of 10 similar worlds. You zoom out farther and you've got a multiverse. So you can play it anywhere in this multiverse, although Harn is the most developed. It should easily scratch the fantasy itch if any of you have a fantasy itch from not having played fantasy for a while, because it is definitely fantasy. And there are many of the familiar tropes and roleplay elements that we're used to, but there are some twists to them. The cons of Harn World are that it's huge and it may be hard to handle in play by post because of that. It's probably going to involve more combat than any of the other settings, either Savage Worlds or, frankly, Call of Cthulhu or Delta Green. It has an extensive lore with an unfamiliar world that may be daunting to new players because there's just so much lore. Pages and pages and pages of lore. Whole books on just the various clerical orders and that sort of thing that just may make it a little overwhelming. And the Magic Rare Medieval Authentic world may not be for everyone. It's not really going to play like D&D. It's going to be a lot more sort of grounded and realistic and less sort of super powered Marvel Cinematic Universe fantastical the way sort of the Rome game was. So it's a lot more grounded in reality. So those are the pros and cons of the different settings and of Savage Worlds. I'm going to make another video about the Lovecraftian stuff, and after you've watched them, then please go ahead and let me know in the Discord and each other know what your favorite settings are, which ones you'd like to play, which one do you think would work best in play by post. Keep that very foremost in your mind because it doesn't matter how good the setting is if it doesn't work in play by post. We kind of can't do it. I think any of these can be made to work, but some are going to be easier than others. So please let me know which one you prefer between this and the Lovecraftian ones.